You said, why New Zealand? Maybe it's because you've got the best prime minister in the world. We're all jealous, at least speaking for my country.
Well, yes, that's right. We're very lucky, yeah. And a great former Prime Minister in Helen Clark, who recently gave comments about Julian, which I could actually play here while we wait.
You do wonder when the hatchet can be buried with Assange, and not buried in his head, by the way, but at some point, could people move on? I mean, I do think that the information that's been disclosed by whistleblowers down through the 80s has been very important, and broader public's getting to know what is really going on behind the scenes. And should people, pay this kind of price for that? I don't think so. I mean, I felt that Chelsea Manning, for example, was really unduly repressed. And we have the young man whose name eludes me for the moment, who's still sitting in Moscow, having fled after dumping the tranche of documents. I mean, the real issue really is the activities they were exposing, not their.
Helen Clark there, speaking about Julian, and also mentioning, of course, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and the important role of whistleblowers. And so it's great to have Helen being a voice there for this important function of our democracy.
Thank you, Matt. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, te whānau rangi Māori e, Adaha nui. This is a new departure for the Aotearoa for Assange coalition, and my name is Liz Remerswal, and I'm the National Coordinator for World Beyond War Aotearoa New Zealand, and we are doing this webinar in partnership with the people working for the Assange. And I just want to acknowledge that I am on the land of Ngāti Kaungunu in Te Mata a Maui, and Heretaunga is the whenua here, and we recognise and remember those who have come before us, those who have nurtured us. And just to start this webinar with a very short karakia. Kia tau te rangi Māori e, o te rangi e tūhine, o papa tuanuku e tāko tēnei, e te tau e awhinei, i rungi i a tātou, te hei mauri ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the ocean below, and of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. So the Aotearoa Assange is welcoming a panel of international experts and is calling on New Zealand, that we call Aotearoa, to lead the way home for Julian Assange, who, as you know, is incarcerated in Belmarsh prison in London. And this group wants to welcome him to these shores and give him a safe haven here. So we have 5 wonderful speakers from all corners, well, some corners of the globe anyway, starting with Matt Brennan from New Zealand, who is the chairperson for Aotearoa for Assange. Then we have the wonderful Daniel Ellsberg, who's coming in, I think, from California in the United States, a famous brave whistleblower, former US military analyst, and was very instrumental in calling out the reality and the brutal horror of the Vietnam War through releasing the Pentagon Papers. Then we have coming in from the United Kingdom, Dr. DEEPA DRIVER, who is an Assange trial observer and academic and professional on transparency and accountability in financial organisations. And then from Australia, we have Greg Barnes, who is a human rights lawyer and author. And finally, we have our own Honourable Matt Robson, who is a former cabinet minister and a lawyer also. So welcome all of our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for your time. So just to start now with you, Matt Brennan, tell us please briefly about this campaign.
Sorry, you just cut out there, Liz. What was the question?
No.
Okay. Just for you, Matt, Brennan, tell us about the campaign.
Very good. Yes, thank you, Liz. Thank you for that beautiful introduction and acknowledgement of our ancestors and the original kaitiaki of this land, Aotearoa. And yeah, so we are here today with these distinguished guests, and thank you to this audience here as well. We really appreciate you being here, and we are here to call upon New Zealand to stand for a member of our South Pacific region who published vital truths for human rights. Julian Assange, an Australian journalist and publisher who courageously published so much evidence of human rights abuses around the world, and especially regarding wars which claimed the lives of millions. And so, yeah, if I can, we will read our open letter, and this is what we will deliver to Jacinda Ardern, our Prime Minister, and Nanaia Mahuta, our Foreign Affairs Minister. And so I'll read that now, and I'll share the screen so you can see it as well. Right. Okay, so
You can mute everyone, please, Matt.
yes, that's right. If anyone there can mute yourselves, let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so Haere Mai Julian Assange. Aotearoa for Assange calls on the New Zealand government to stand for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, a member of our South Pacific region who published vital truths in the public interest. His imprisonment and the charges against him are perilous to global human rights, the public's right to know, and peace. United Nations, Amnesty International, and every major human rights group in the world are calling for Julian Assange to be freed. The charges against Mr. Assange criminalize fundamental journalistic practices. The UN says he has been arbitrarily detained for 11 years. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture says he is being psychologically tortured. He is currently detained without bail and in solitary confinement, despite winning his case against extradition in January. Hundreds of doctors have signed a letter warning that his life is in peril. On October 27, the US seeks to appeal the decision not to extradite Mr. Assange. This despite the recent report that top US officials discussed plots to kidnap, poison, and assassinate Mr. Assange. The International Bar Association Human Rights Institute has said the legal proceedings against Mr. Assange have represented the serious undermining of due processes and the rule of law. Nobody, therefore, can pretend that justice can be served by ongoing US extradition proceedings. An assassination plot against a South Pacific journalist for revealing war crimes demands a clear response from New Zealand, a nation trusted for its views on human rights. New Zealand can use its position as a small principled nation to stand for Julian Assange. Doing so will have New Zealand standing by our beliefs on transparent democracy, he kawanatanga a iwi, human rights, tika tangata, and peace. Rangi Marie. We call on our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and our Foreign Affairs Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, to lead the way home for Julian Assange by welcoming him to our shores. Kia ora.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt, for that very impassioned plea. And I'd just like to recognise how hard you've been working on this kaupapa for some time. Well done. So our first speaker is Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel is, as you probably know, a former US military analyst employed by the RAND Corporation, who precipitated a national political controversy in 1971, which is just over 50 years ago, when he released the Pentagon Papers, a top secret Pentagon study of US government decision-making about the Vietnam War, to the New York Times and other newspapers. His most recent book is entitled The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And I think you've recently celebrated your 90th birthday, Daniel, so congratulations. It just shows you that activists and whistleblowers live a very long, productive and healthy life. Can you unmute, please, Daniel? Or Matt, can you unmute him, please?
Yeah, okay, that's, we're always looking for new inducements for people to be whistleblowers. So you've given me another one there. I identify very much with Julian Assange and actually with his source, Chelsea Manning. I was the first American to be charged under any act, and specifically under the same act that is invoked with Julian, the Espionage Act. I was the first one to be prosecuted for giving true information to my fellow countrymen, to Americans, treating me as if I were a spy, although I wasn't charged with being a spy, simply a non-espionage case under the Espionage Act, which was the first time that's happened. The use of that act has never been addressed by our Supreme Court. And the best legal positions at that time, and I think still, say that I should not have been tried under that because that use clearly violated our US First Amendment, which forbids legislation that would abridge freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And in this case, putting out thousands of pages of true information about government crimes, lies, breaking of treaties, clearly was in the public interest and should not have led to prosecution. And that argument has never yet been heard by the Supreme Court over 50 years, even though other people have been tried under that very questionably. Second, and this again I share with Julian, is that a trial under that act in the US cannot be a fair trial, because the Espionage Act is treated as a strict liability act in legislation crime in which there is no appeal to motives, impact, purposes, why you did the act. I was not permitted to say, why did you answer the question? Why did you copy the Pentagon Papers? Obviously, a trial, and this is applied now to all the trials of whistleblowers since, and would apply to Julian, that could not permit that person to tell the jury why they did what they did and what the purpose of it was, that it was to serve a public interest, and that no bad impact actually occurred. All of these whistleblowers could have made that argument. Not one was able to, and that means not one was able to give have a fair trial in front of this. The third reason, in my case, which again applies to Julian, was that it was discovered during my trial, just before we went to the jury, actually, that the government had committed a number of crimes against me in efforts to shut me up, aside from putting me on trial, but to keep me from revealing secrets of the Nixon administration. The Pentagon Papers ended in 1968, before Nixon came into office, so they didn't incriminate him directly. But he was committing crimes, including various forms of enlarging the war aggressively, even using nuclear weapons. And to promote that policy, he had to keep it secret from the American public. Obviously not from the Vietnamese or their Russian allies or the Chinese, because they were the ones being threatened. But he didn't want the US to know that we were considering expanding the war to that extent. And to that effort then, efforts were made to incapacitate me totally, meaning the prosecutor thought to kill me, but possibly not that, just to shut me up thoroughly at a time when they feared that I would reveal these nuclear threats he was making against North Vietnam. I did have information on Nixon, but unfortunately I didn't have the documents he feared. But I might have if people who did have those documents had given them, as I believe they should have done, to the public. As one of them put to me, we should have thrown open the safes and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was. And he regarded that as his greatest shame and regret in his life, that he had not done that. That was Roger Morris, a deputy to Henry Kissinger. Now, we now learn that Julian Assange was subject not only to illegal surveillance, as I was, which figured in the dropping of my charges in the end, warrantless wiretapping, and in his case, wiretapping even of all of his conversations in the Ecuadorian embassy with his lawyers and his doctors. And revelation of that the prosecution had that information on hand should be more than enough to drop the prosecution in the US. It did in my case. Whether it would with Julian's in the new climate, we don't know, but it should. And beyond that, we know that there was discussion, consideration of options of kidnapping him or killing him, poisoning him in general, just as there was this effort to incapacitate me, again, which led to dropping of charges. So on all these grounds, he should not be under trial, and given that he is indicted, he should not be extradited. It is extremely important, especially to journalists in the US, but not only the US. Keeping in mind, Julian himself is not American. It's a question of kidnapping, if you like, almost what they considered was what they called, what is it? They had a name for it. Anyway, for kidnapping people, basically, to be tortured in other countries during the War on Terror. And in his case, entering the embassy and kidnapping him and perhaps killing him. So there's every reason not to extradite him. It's shameful that President Biden has gone in the footsteps of President Trump, who in his last day in office put in an appeal to the order of Judge Barretser in England not to extradite him. And they appealed that in order to extradite him. President Biden was vice president when President Obama chose not to indict Julian Assange on the grounds that I've described, that it was unconstitutional. And if you followed that, there would be no rationale explaining why you were not prosecuting the New York Times, which was doing the same thing as Julian, in my case and his case, both. And rather than do that, they didn't indict him. But Trump, not surprisingly, indicted him and then appealed this order of Judge Barretser. It is shameful for President Biden to have continued that appeal, to renew that appeal. Not entirely surprising, because Biden, when he was vice president in 2010, actually responded to Julian's revelation of truths about the war by calling him a high-tech terrorist. And that was a time, by the way, when Hillary Clinton was reported to have said, "Why don't we just drone him?" And she went on to say, well, that was a joke. Other people present didn't think it was a joke. And we now know that President Obama actually did drone American citizens, including Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen born in America, no trial, no judge, no due process, whatever, just droned him. So I think it wasn't a joke about doing to Julian as well. To allow this to go ahead, then, under President Biden, is to put a target, a bullseye, on the back of every journalist in the world who might consider doing real investigative journalism of what we call the national defense, actually, or security, better called simply the military budget or military interventions. And to do what must be done in terms of revealing those things, to assure every journalist that he or she, as well as her sources, can be put in prison, kidnapped if necessary to the US, is going to chill that to a degree that there will be more Vietnams, more Iraq, more acts of aggression, such as we've just seen, and the world cannot afford that. So a great deal rides, not just humanitarian, though that is significant in the case of Julian, but a great deal rides in policy matters on the possibility of freedom in countries of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And we'll be taking some questions and answers at the end of this. So thanks for explaining that. It must very, very chilling what's going on. So our next speaker is Dr. DEEPA DRIVER. And she is one of the lead campaigners for Julian Assange in the UK. And also a member of IMAC, the International Capital Market Association, a senior finance professional in Europe and the UK, specializing in the qualitative aspects of risk, corporate accountability and regulation. So she served as independent expert advisor evaluating risk management frameworks and strategic decision-making in corporates. You're an elected negotiator on pensions matters for the £80 billion USS pension fund, and I just noticed too that you speak English, German, and working at the university. So welcome, and DEEPA, and thank you very much for joining us. What's your involvement with Julian, and where are things at the moment?
Thanks very much for having me. It's always a hard act to follow Daniel Ellsberg because, you know, when somebody with so much courage and so much character has gone before you, it's hard for somebody like me who's a grassroots activist to say anything that would, you know, Daniel said most of the important things that we need to highlight in this case. My involvement, like many people I know and work with, has been with having WikiLeaks in the background and knowing about it and being very supportive of it, but not realizing how difficult Julian's circumstances in the embassy were. And realizing as we got to the stage where Julian was being pushed out of the embassy, how serious things were and how, and then beginning to investigate it myself and look into it. And I've been serving for the last just over a year and a half as the legal observer for the Haldean Society of Socialist Lawyers on Julian's case. I've been attending both the administrative hearings and the extradition process. And I'll start off by saying, sorry, I just realized there's a small child who's walked into the room, so I apologize. This child who should be in bed, I'm really sorry. Darling, thank you very much. Oh, can you go to bed, please? Just bear with me 1 second and I'm just going to make sure that Dad gets up. Thank you. Very sweet, but you need to
Okay.
He has to come back. Rod?
This is the life of a grassroots activist, juggling children and responsibilities and working life, and probably like most grassroots activists working late into the night. Welcome back, DEEPA.
That's right. And for the young generation that we have the need to make sure we leave a world for them that where the truth is protected and the public has a right to know. Yeah, thank you. How you
Not
doing?
to get distracted. Sorry, I'm so embarrassed. So one of the things that really, as I began to understand more about WikiLeaks, one of the things that I began to realize was how important WikiLeaks was at the time when Julian conceived it. So Julian had been thinking about it for a number of years, but when WikiLeaks came onto the scene, we had a situation where there was vast amounts of data now suddenly available electronically. So you didn't have to do the kinds of things that Daniel did in terms of photocopying things overnight. And whistleblowers needed to pass on this information securely to journalists. And WikiLeaks offered this new technological innovation, which allowed both security of the documentation as well as security for the whistleblower in terms of ensuring that if you look at what happened to whistleblowers, for example, when Chelsea Manning was placed in a little box, kept in a cell where the lights were on all the time, not allowed to wear her own clothes. The kinds of horrors that national security whistleblowers face are significant. But more generally, even if you're somebody who's concerned, for example, about environmental degradation, WikiLeaks revealed a lot of information about toxic waste dumping off the Ivory Coast. They revealed information about corruption in Kenya in Daniel Arap Moi's government. And they revealed information in Tunisia where there was a serious political change as a result of it. So getting this information out was really important. But it was also important that this information, in a situation where there was quite oligopolistic news agency ownership, that this information was provided both to big institutions like The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post, but also to smaller institutions that could parse the information effectively, look at it clearly, and provide analysis that was relevant to the local jurisdiction, because what the Tunisian local papers were interested in or the Lebanese local papers were interested in may not have been of interest to people looking at global news at the Washington Post or the New York Times. The other thing that made Julian's work really special and important was the context in which he was operating, where a number of other journalists some were client journalists who were reliant upon the state to give them information so that they could keep their jobs, because they were reliant on these sources. And so a lot of militaristic, pro-war type information got put out without sufficient critical intervention. But also there were situations where people like Patrick Coburn, who were very experienced journalists, knew about things, but didn't have sufficient evidence to be able to put that information in the public domain. And Julian and the people at WikiLeaks allowed for both this technological development, the challenge of the established entities, whether they were large or small, the ability to archive information and to reconcile it, for example, 10 years from now with declassified data, which you couldn't do if, say, a journalist looked at a piece of information and just parsed out what they thought was relevant and important at a given point in time. So WikiLeaks brought about this major change, which in turn is why Julian is in the situation he is now, because Julian allowed us, instead of the state surveilling us, which, you can see through the Vault 7 leaks, how much the state knows about what's going on in your daily lives. But all of a sudden, Julian turned to the tables and he said, we are surveilling the state and we are stopping the state from taking actions which are not in our interest. So let me give you an example of Khalid Al-Masri. He's a German citizen who was abducted on the Macedonian border and then reindicted. He was taken to a CIA black site where he was tortured. By the time Khalid Al-Masri was taken to the CIA black site, the CIA already knew this was a case of mistaken identity. And despite that, Al-Masri continued to be tortured because certain people at the CIA thought that he was a wrong un anyway, right? And this continued for several months until he was then released again on the Albanian border. He thought he was released in the middle of the night. He thought he was going to be shot in the back of the head. He was returned to Germany, where nobody believed his story. Had it not been for WikiLeaks releases, Mr. Al-Masri would never have got justice. It was only, it was only through WikiLeaks releases that we knew that the Americans put huge amounts of pressure on the German government not to take action against the CIA operatives who engaged in that rendition. And this could happen to you, to your family, to somebody you know, because without those who understand what's happening behind closed doors, telling you what's going on, whether it is in a care home, whether it is with your children at a, or whether it is with the environmental pollution, whether it is with a range of things where corporations control things, whether it's vaccines. You won't know what's going on were it not for important whistleblowers like Chelsea, like Edward Snowden, but also those whistleblowers who don't have a public profile, who wish to stay anonymous, who wish to stay within the system and uphold it from within, and who don't want to, may not be able to withstand the kind of public pressure, the governmental scrutiny that whistleblowers get when they reveal the truth. So what Julian did was really important. He's now in a situation where, I mean, I as an observer in court, I see how he is being tortured on a day-to-day basis. As some of you will know, Julian's had a shoulder injury since 2012. The British government refused to allow him out of the embassy to have that shoulder injury treated. He had an exposed root of his tooth where the dental pulp was showing, and the dentist wanted for specialist care or treatment under a specialist dental practice, but the UK didn't allow this. He's been in the court process. He's somebody who has osteoporosis. He's forced to kneel and talk through a tiny gap in the plexiglass to be able to talk to his lawyers who sit 2 rows ahead, and he has to try and wave past the American agents who are sitting between him and where the lawyers are sitting in order to catch their attention, in order to participate in court. He's even denied the basic right, which somebody with serious mental health issues that Julian now faces as a result of chronic, as a result of continued torture, should be getting. What's also really terrible about the process, and Daniel's talked about this, is the fact that his privileged conversations with his lawyers were spied upon, conversations with his doctors and medical professionals were spied upon. He's in a position where, sorry, I'm getting a feedback.
Sorry, not sure what happened there. I think that's fine now.
Is it okay if I speak now? Yeah. He's in a position where he's constantly been denied basic dignity, whether it is, being allowed to meet with his family on a regular basis, meet with his lawyers to prepare his process, the basic due process of, being able to understand what the case against him is. He was served the second superseding indictment on the first day of trial. When he took his papers home with him, to the prison back with him, the papers were taken off him. So his privileged papers were taken off him. He was handcuffed, cavity searched, stripped naked. On a day-to-day basis, a highly intelligent human being who already we know is on the autism spectrum, to be put through the indignities and the arbitrariness of the process, which is consistently working in a way that doesn't stand with normal process, whether it is Keir Starmer's CPS saying to the Swedes, don't you dare get cold feet, this case is not being treated like any other, and holding various allegations in limbo so that he cannot defend himself, through to a process where he's treated as a bail jumper for seeking asylum at a time when his life is at risk. And we know that both the UK authorities and other Swedish authorities knew that Julian's life was at risk from the information that we know from the case of Agiza and El-Zari, who were 2 Egyptian asylum seekers who were indicted by Sweden to Egypt, where they were subsequently tortured. And this was a few years before Julian was talking about the fact that he was concerned about onward rendition to the United States. So all through the process, the basic understanding that you would give to anyone else has not been granted to him. And he's always been treated in a very derogatory, in a smearing kind of way. And for somebody who has gone through this for a number of years, it has not just psychological effects. A lot of people talk about Julian's psychological torture, but I wanted to talk about the tooth pain and the shoulder pain to say this is not just psychological. The physical effects of torture are pretty severe, including the internal damage that he has. I don't know how we're doing for time, so I'm quite happy to answer any questions. I think as far as the UK legal process goes, we expect that the High Court will recognise the kind of serious, gross breaches of Julian's basic rights and the inability for him to have a fair trial in the UK or in the US, and that this case will be dismissed immediately. And if he is, I would hope that he would have the opportunity to be reunited with his family and have some amount of care and restitution for what he's been put through. And I'll stop there. And thank you very much for listening to me. And sorry about the interruption earlier.
Thank you, Deepa. That was wonderful to hear something about the humanity of what Julian is suffering, and thank you for supporting him. And look, if I was you, I wouldn't feel bad about the child, because I was reading about Daniel Ellsberg, and I believe he used to get his young children to come into the office in the middle of the night and help him photograph the Pentagon papers. Is that right, Daniel?
Yes, just the purpose there was I expected to be in prison very shortly, and would see them for the rest of my life only through glass. Of course, Julian is in this situation now of having 2 young children, but I wanted them to see that I was doing this in a business-like, patriotic way, actually, that I hadn't gone mad because I knew they would hear that I'd gone mad or that I was a traitor. And I wanted them to see that this was their father and I was doing something that I thought was necessary and right, and it did have that effect. So that's why it wasn't because I needed their help, but I wanted to set them on the right path, knowing that someday they might have to do the same.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, forgive my disrespect. Okay, our next speaker is Greg Barnes, who is an advisor to the Australian Assange campaign, and a barrister and a writer and a columnist with the Hobart Mercury, and author of The Rise to the Right, as well as a company director and a former political candidate who's in Tasmania, and also a Queen's Counsel, I believe. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you very much. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I sit today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Can I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm going to make some brief comments really from the Australian perspective. As you know, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. He's an Australian citizen who had his passport renewed about 3 or 4 years ago. He remains an Australian citizen. His family lives in Australia. I do a lot of work with his father, John Shipton. And what I wanted to talk about was the responsibility of the Australian government in this case. The responsibility of the Australian government is very clear. This is an Australian citizen who is facing 175 years imprisonment. That's what is known in the anti-death penalty movement rightly as an effective death penalty. Australia is opposed to the death penalty, and Australia has intervened in cases, particularly in Asia, over the past decade, or certainly the past 15 years, sometimes successfully, often unsuccessfully, but it has made serious overtures to foreign governments in Singapore, in Indonesia and in China in relation to this matter. Not the Assange matter, but other Australians who found themselves on death row. So that's the first point. The second point is that we now know, not that I think it should have been any surprise to us, that the CIA intended effectively to murder Assange. For an Australian citizen to be put in that position by Australia's #1 ally is intolerable. And I think in the minds of most Australians, the view is that the Australian government ought to intervene in this particular case and ensure the safety of one of its citizens. Bob Carr, the former Australian Foreign Minister, with whom I've done a fair bit of work on this issue over the past few years, has made this point, and it's a very valid point, that Australia likes to see itself, and the recent signing of the AUKUS agreement is testament to this. Australia likes to see itself as being the number one most solid ally of the United States. Many of us, of course, are deeply troubled by this, but leaving that to one side, if that is the case, then there is nothing stopping Scott Morrison, Prime Minister, and Maurice Payne, the Foreign Minister, from picking up the phone or having a Zoom call, or whatever it takes, to say to President Biden and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, that the end must be now in relation to the Assange case. This is a case where there is strong public support for Julian Assange. In the minds of many people, and many people I speak to, leaving aside the original reason that, of course, Assange was hunted down by the Americans, the reason is really that this has gone on too long. To pick up some of Deepa's points, that this is now a humanitarian issue, that you can't continually to slowly torture someone. And I do a lot of work for prisoners, and let me tell you, the rigors of the Anglo-American prison complex, which we have here in Australia, and which Julian is facing at Belmarsh, are such that very few people survive that system without having severe mental and physical pain and suffering for the rest of their lives. And this just shouldn't be happening to an Australian citizen whose only, and I put crime in quotes here, whose only crime has been to reveal the war crimes of the United States and its allies. It's somewhat ironic that we now have in Australia the prosecution of individuals, Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, for war crimes, and in fact the government establishing a war crimes unit at the same time that one of its citizens is being persecuted by the United States. Which brings me to New Zealand and the great work that Matt and Liz and others are doing in that context. I think most Australians see New Zealand as being a more progressive nation, and a nation which has, to Australia's shame, picked up on humanitarian issues over the years. I'm not sure if Matthew Robson was around in these times in government. I suspect you were, Matthew, but I remember when Helen Clark, as Prime Minister, effectively intervened after the Australian government's infamous Tampa incident, where Australia pushed back a ship of 400 odd desperate asylum seekers, and then created what's called the Pacific Solution, where they effectively detained people in horrific conditions in Nauru and in Papua New Guinea. Helen Clark at the time, and in fact Jacinda Ardern has done it in more recent times, has made overtures to the Australian government to say, we'll take some of these people. And in fact, in the case of Helen Clark, I think did take some refugees. So New Zealand plays a very prominent and important role in the Asia-Pacific region. And it is not beyond the realms of possibility, and I mean possibility, that the New Zealand government could offer Julian Assange what Australia appears to be incapable of doing, and that is safety for himself and his family. And so whilst some people would say, well, why should New Zealand do it because he's an Australian citizen? I think the attitude of New Zealand and the attitude of New Zealanders in the minds of many Australians is that it picks up where Australia refuses to go. And in the case of Assange, this is an ideal opportunity for New Zealand to do that yet again. The last thing I'll say before we move to the next speaker is that the continued pressure on the Australian government is critical. I remember back in 2004-05, in the case of David Hicks, an Australian at Guantanamo Bay, it was political pressure on the then very conservative government of John Howard, which saw David Hicks return to Australia. In other words, whilst many people a year or two earlier had said the Hicks case is one that's hopeless, forget about it, within a year, Australia was bringing Hicks home because of political pressure. So the political pressure is really, really important, not just by Australians and the work we do with other Australians in trying to put pressure on the government, but international pressure through people such as yourselves calling on the Australian government to do the right thing. Thanks very much, and I'm also happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Greg. And Great to hear the importance of political pressure. So our next speaker is the Honourable Matt Robson, former Cabinet Minister, and who had a colourful political history with Labour Party and the Progressive Party and the Alliance, and is now a lawyer and involved in many good causes, such as the Ahmed Zaoui campaign and other things as well. So welcome, Matt, and over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm following my co-panelists. They've laid out for you the case of Julian Assange and what he's done for humanity. If I may quote from Edward Snowden, who to the Belmarsh Tribunal just held in London, named after the prison where Julian Assange is wrongfully held, he said the following: "If you love truth, you're as much of a criminal as Julian Assange and risk sharing his fate. We are all indicted co-conspirators in Assange's quest to raise a lantern in the halls of power. What is happening to Julian is a crime, and he must be freed. If we're going to free the world, we must free Assange." And in answer to Greg Barnes's question, yes, I was a cabinet minister with Helen Clark at the time of the tamper. It took us only a few seconds to affirm that we would take these people as refugees. And as the Minister of Prisons at the time, my officials wrongfully held some of the young people on that boat, young men, as suspected criminals, terrorists, because they were young and had no family support, etc. I went down and was able to free them. That's what members of parliament can do. That's what governments can do when they do the right thing. And my plea on this panel is to my former colleagues, Nanaia Mahuta, the Minister of Foreign Affairs amongst them, and Jacinda Ardern, who was a staffer in Helen Clark's office. Follow what you have said about shared democratic values with our traditional allies. And by that, they meant the United States and the United Kingdom. And remember the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which New Zealand was pleased to sign in 1945, one of the first signers, where it said, "Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in a barbarous act which have outraged the conscience of mankind, in the event of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people." That is law, that is international law. We are bound by that as a country. And to uphold the international law is one of the values that has been proclaimed by my former colleagues and the present government. To see Daniel Ellsberg on this panel is wonderful, because as a young student, I and my fellow students, and I recognize many names here, took the Pentagon Papers as our Bible, and thousands of New Zealanders were exposed to the truth that the governments before had lied about the brutality. The 3 to 5 million people we now know lie dead in Vietnam because of an imperialist war and aggression. And we were able to use that whistleblowing and that truth revealed to re-establish New Zealand's honour in the international stage. The incoming 1972 Labour government pulled out the soldiers and bowed to the public demand of out now, end the war, end New Zealand's participation. Liz mentioned the Ahmed Zaoui case, a member of parliament, persecuted member of parliament from Algeria who sought refuge here. Shamefully, we kept him in prison for 2 years. He wasn't given due process. Now he's a citizen of New Zealand once the truth came out. The Five Eyes provided false information to the New Zealand government on this man. And that's a lesson. That's a lesson that has been hammered home by Daniel, by DEEPA, of what happens when there isn't due process of law. Now, my message, as I said, is to my former colleagues and others, members of parliament. I watched the Belmarsh Tribunal, and all of you can watch it on Facebook, YouTube. And there you will see 4 brave British members of parliament who stand up for Julian Assange and what he means for the rest of the world, for truth and for being able to surveil the state, as DEEPA so eloquently put it. There were 3 members of the parliament from Germany. They also spoke out. And around the world, resolutions have been passed by parliaments. I call on the Labour government of New Zealand to live up to the esteem which Jacinda Ardern is held in across the world as a champion of justice, by picking up the phone to President Biden as a co-member of the Five Eyes, to Scott Morrison and to Boris Johnson, and saying that the New Zealand government wants this man, whose only crime is to tell the truth to the people of the world about illegal wrongdoings of their own governments, to have him freed, and to tell them that Julian Assange is welcome in New Zealand. He is an Australian citizen and automatically a permanent resident of New Zealand. We in New Zealand share something called the Anzac traditions, Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, forged in the imperialist war of the First World War, but still the bond between Australia and New Zealand. Here is a bond that we can re-establish. When the Labour Party was founded in 1916, it was founded largely by Australian immigrants from the labour movement there who came to New Zealand as they saw it as a more progressive country. And they wanted a Labour Party to act for the people of New Zealand for justice. One of their first acts was to oppose the war of the British Empire and the thousands and thousands of young New Zealanders who were dying for that empire and that struggle between imperialist powers. When the whistleblowers of the Bolshevik government of 1917 published the secret treaties of the Tsarist Empire, which showed that the war was about countries dividing up the world further amongst themselves, the Labour Party of the time supported the whistleblowers. In 1929, New Zealand was an occupying power of Samoa, and the Labour Party, in opposition, supported the independence movement and relied on documents to show that New Zealand forces had shot down in the streets of the capital of Samoa fighters for Samoan independence. The New Zealand Labour Party supported the struggle of the Irish for freedom and for the political prisoners who were wrongfully kept by the British Empire. They supported the war of the Republicans against fascism in Spain. And then in 1945, we were one of the first signers of setting up the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in New Zealand, we can recover that tradition. We can support this light of freedom, which is what Julian Assange is, this brave publisher and journalist who has committed the same crime, in inverted commas, as Daniel Ellsberg and many others have committed, to tell the truth as a good journalist and an honest journalist should do. So our letter to our government is a plea from people right across New Zealand to do the right thing, to do the cause of justice and New Zealand, Aotearoa, proud. Free Julian Assange, and say that directly on the line that's available to President Biden, to all of those other countries which you sit with in the Five Eyes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. And very eloquently said, I must say. And you know, just also recognizing that you were, of course, born in Australia and an Australian. So it's
I'm a refugee.
important that we work together. So, so next we're going to have some questions, and I think Matt wants to say a couple of words before that, but I would like to actually, there's a couple of journalists here or on the Zoom from the Evening Report and News Hub. So I'd like to give you both the chance to ask a question if you would like to, first of all. There's also a couple of questions in the chat. And also it could be that some of the panelists might want to ask a question of each other. So I would like to give that opportunity also. So, but first of all, Matt, you just wanted to make a brief closing comment.
Yes, thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for doing a marvelous job hosting. Yeah, I'll keep it brief so we can have those journalists ask the questions. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, yeah, picking up on some comments, you know, that, you know, when you think about it, New Zealand, we protested on the streets about the war, not to enter the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. And in fact, millions around the world did the same. There were hundreds of thousands on the streets of Sydney, hundreds of thousands on the streets of New York, and we also marched. And it turned out that the war in Iraq was waged on lies told to the public. And what is the result of these lies? 500,000 Iraqis, 90% of whom are civilians. Not to mention the other millions that were displaced from their homes because their homes were reduced to rubble. So this is the cost of lies. And those that are not interested in maintaining peace and not interested in what the public has to say about that, more importantly, would very aware that we actually have power to call into account. If we didn't have our elected representatives to account, they would not be going after Julian Assange as viciously as they have done. So take power, everybody, and know that that is what democracy is. Every one of us has the power to hold our elected representatives to account. So reach out to your MPs, tell your whānau and your friends to stand for Assange. Why? Because it's your right to know what's going on in the world. It's your right to have a say in the world.
Okay.
Especially about matters as important as peace and human rights. And one more thing I'll say is that it may seem a bit, you know, how does this affect New Zealand? Well, there are many ways, but I will just point to one experience that I had recently that will show how this case against Assange is already chilling our ability to know what's going on and have truth tellers stand for the truth. Now, I was involved to organize a celebration for Julian Assange's 50th birthday. Military confinement at the time, but we celebrated him in Aotearoa Square in Auckland. And so I went to buy some helium balloons and some big 5-0 and a big J for Julian. And the shop here in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, was in Henderson, a spotlight store, and where I bought the balloons, I mentioned that these are for Julian Assange, and the young lady behind the counter's ears pricked up, and she said, "Are these for Julian Assange?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, I asked her, "How do you know Julian Assange?" And she said that she had wanted to become a journalist. And she said, however, that when she found out what's happening to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, she changed her mind. She decided she was not going to study journalism and she wasn't going to become a journalist. So I hope that goes to show that this case is already having an impact on our younger generation and their feelings of safety to speak truth to power. So we must stand for Julian Assange, New Zealand. And we do. We call on Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and our Foreign Affairs Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, to stand for a member of our South community who stood for our right to know. And now we must stand for Assange to maintain our right to know. Kia ora.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so just before we head to the Q&A, and I'm just wondering, Selwyn, are you there? Would you like to ask a question? Selwyn Manning from Evening Report, or I'm not sure if you're here, but Or perhaps, is there anyone on the panel who would like to ask a question of another panelist? No, can't hear anybody. So there is a question here from Brian Wheeldon, which is to the panel. How does the fact that New Zealand is an integral part of the Five Eyes covert spy network fit in with the panel, please?
Oh, well, perhaps as the New Zealander here, it's a problem. And it's a problem that Julian Assange has helped us to consider. The Five Eyes and New Zealand's role is to gather information across the world and feed it by electronic means and by human intelligence and feed it across the world. That intelligence has been used in so many nefarious ways, both past and present. In Indonesia, in 1965, the human intelligence gathered by New Zealand as part of the Five Eyes was used by the United States to contract lists of dissidents who were handed over to the military and the religious gangs that were organized. And those people were killed, up to 1 million people, the estimates are, and imprisoned and tortured. In Vietnam, through the Five Eyes, New Zealand provided the information for the B-52 bombers to strike targets within Vietnam. In East Timor, along with Australia, but particularly Australia, the Indonesians were helped in the suppression of the just cause of the East Timorese for liberation. And just recently, Julian Assange was able to print through WikiLeaks information on the spying that the Australian government did during talks with East Timor over the question of oil deposits in the Timor Strait. And of course, we have learned of the spying on United Nations delegations and government figures. And New Zealand is now being drawn in through the Five Eyes and the information it gathers to the policy, the pivot to Asia of the United States for the containment of China. And as Daniel Ellsberg had shown in his other papers in relation after the Pentagon Papers, that the use of nuclear weapons has long been considered by New Zealand military planners. And New Zealand, being a country that has no nuclear weapons, has specific legislation banning all nuclear weapons either stationed or transited through New Zealand. It gives us a great problem. So an analysis of the Five Eyes is long overdue, and our role within it and what it actually does. And that's where Julian Assange, as printer of the truth, and other journalists can play a very big role.
I just wonder, with Daniel, if you would like to say something about the Five Eyes, which the Five Eyes, of course, is Australia, New Zealand, UK, the US, and Canada, and it's a very responsible for spreading information, most of which goes back to the United States. Daniel, have you got some comments about that, the Five Eyes, how that relates to Julian? Can you unmute, please?
Yeah, don't think he realizes he's muted.
Daniel, can you unmute, please? Can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry. I said, listening to Matthew on that litany of occasions of the participation of New Zealand means that New Zealand does have a lot of blood on their hands on this. Actually, the participation with Indonesia providing names was participation in a process of genocide or politicide, it could be called, from between 400,000 at a minimum up to 2 million people, civilians, virtually all unarmed civilians, slaughtered by machetes and in other ways. The US provided names, as they've actually admitted without shame. Clearly, subject to indictment in the criminal court in The Hague, if any great power any could imagine accepting any themselves to be held accountable for anything. But it's not only Indonesia, the other cases as well. In Vietnam, evidently, up until 1972, should not have been involved. There is a personal aspect to that. When the Pentagon Papers came out in 1971, a year earlier, the administration, particularly Henry Kissinger and others, said, this has greatly embarrassed us with our relations with other countries and caused problems in our foreign relations. And when pressed for a specific example of that, the only one I remember is Australia did complain that the revelation of these papers had shown that Australia's participation, like that of South Korea, was essentially bought, bribed by in various ways, because Johnson wanted what he called more flags, wanted us to be accompanied in this criminal operation by some other suspects, so they wouldn't be the only ones, even hypothetically, in a world court. But I learned in the course of that controversy that it had come out in the Pentagon Papers, correct me if I'm wrong, that Australia had instituted the draft in order to send people to Vietnam. Now that's as outrageous a policy or action as I can imagine, practically. And when I heard that, I remembered saying, I'm very glad to have embarrassed them on that one. They needed a lot of embarrassing. So clearly then, nobody, why should New Zealand be the one to offer to let Assange in? Well, I'll give the main reason. There are many countries in the world in which Assange and Ed Snowden, for example, are very popular. I understand that in Germany there were many windows that had a sign in them, Ed Snowden has a bed here. And there are many countries that would have been supportive of Assange, none of whom wanted to get into trouble with the United States of America and to in any way irritate their relations with them. Of all the countries in the world, I think you can pick out New Zealand as one who has dared to do that in the past. I remember the issue over whether they would allow American warships into New Zealand harbors. And remember, as you may or may not have known, it was testified at that time, virtually every American ship in the 60s, let's say, and the 70s, larger than a destroyer escort, in fact, even a destroyer escort, had nuclear weapons aboard. Why? For nuclear mines, I should say, mines against submarines, and some anti-aircraft material and others with. New Zealand refused that, and as I recall, got in a good deal of friction with the United States as a result of that. And I'm sorry to hear they're still cooperating as much as they are with the empire of which I am a citizen.
Thank you, Daniel. There's a couple of questions around how Julian would be welcomed into New Zealand. One from Farrell Cleary about saying that he would automatically be safe as an Australian citizen, and another one from Grave Southern. What would the reasons be that the government might be reluctant to receive Julian Assange? So,
well, the law is that Australians are automatically permanent residents of New Zealand, with a proviso that someone can be denied entry if they've got a criminal record or something else against the interests of New Zealand. And as Julian Assange has not got a criminal record and has been falsely accused, but it could also fall under the category of being a protected person, a refugee. There's a lot of space for it, but New Zealand just has to determine that he's not a threat, and he automatically, there's no paperwork. He just comes in, as long as he isolates for quarantine for COVID at the moment. But and his family can also be granted the right to come with him. It isn't difficult. It's easy. But the point is that if New Zealand does this, he may not wish to come. It would be an extremely important act because, as has been pointed out by my co-panelists, he's under threat of assassination. I don't believe that that target on his head has been taken away, and New Zealand will be in a position to give him further safety as well, given the basic security of our country, its distance from other countries' ability to keep him safe. He could also publish here in New Zealand. The question, of course, will be whether the government, on such an important fundamental issue enshrined in our Bill of Rights, as well as all the international covenants to which we subscribe as international law, has the moral fortitude to give protection to Julian Assange.
Yes, and I wonder, with the new alliance between the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia, AUKUS, and with the deal to get Australia to manufacture some nuclear-powered submarines, I wonder what Julian would be saying about that. And I don't know if Greg or DEEPA, if you've got any comments about this new alliance.
I mean, I think that what it does is that it further entrenches the fact that New Zealand is moving away from, in some ways, I mean, Matt will know this better than me, but to pick up Daniel's point, that New Zealand is, while still a member of the alliance, it's in a much looser position than Australia. I mean, you know, the fact is it's not a member of the AUKUS alliance, which is, I think, to its credit, and I think Jacinda Ardern wisely and diplomatically made the point that she didn't expect to be invited. But what it does show is that when it comes to Australia and New Zealand, I think a lot of Australians take the view that New Zealand is very wise not to be part of AUKUS. But also, I think it demonstrates, again, the point that I made earlier, which is that I think that as an Australian citizen, one would expect the Australian government to be working overtime on the Assange case. And in fact, have brought him home by now. The fact that it hasn't means that other, you know, the nation across Bass Strait, not Bass Strait, the Tasman Sea, you know, picks up where Australia dares to go, or refuses to go. And so, and I think the fact that the AUKUS alliance, which could be used as a positive by Australia in order to bring Assange home, because it's embedded Australia even further with the United States. The reality is that it's probably a better chance for New Zealand to show that it's committed to the sort of values that we've been talking about here today by, in fact, taking in this particular permanent resident.
Just to clarify too, about Julian's criminal record, Jax Taylor comments that he thinks sadly that technically Julian may have a criminal record and his incarceration based on him fleeing for sanctuary into the Ecuadorian embassy in the first place. Is that in fact the case?
Well, he's got a breach of bail. Matt will know this better than me, but certainly in Australia, that would not be an impediment to someone coming to Australia. A breach of bail is a relatively minor offence. In this particular case, you have extraordinary circumstances that led to the breach. And even, as I say, even in Australia, that would not prevent a person from coming to Australia.
No, and particularly in the context of being a refugee, when it's recognised by the jurisprudence internationally, that people who are in this situation often have to either technically or get involved in some way with some breach, but which is not a voluntary crime in any way. And in his case also, even if there was something brought up so minor, the ministers have the power of waiver, and that would be exercised as it has been for thousands of people and hundreds who I've acted for as refugees.
Yeah. And so similarly in Australia.
Thank you. DEEPA, I'd like to come back to you. Just a question about how is Julian Ricard regarded in the United Kingdom? I know there are some very high profile supporters that he has. And of course, John Piljoe, the famous Australian journalist who resides in London, is very supportive, and Nobel Prize winner Mairead Maguire from Northern Ireland, she's a great supporter of Julian, and etc. And I think there's some people like pop stars and so on who are coming out. But in general, is this something that in your country is really talked about and discussed and thought about very much?
I think we've now got to a point where we have a certain critical mass, and I think meetings like this one are particularly important because whether they are small or large meetings, it's not easy to prejudge who might be in there, who might be able to progress the cause of freeing Julian. In terms of ordinary people in this country, at least the ones I've spoken to, people in everyday jobs, it is interesting how easily they have seen through some of the smears and some of the distortions around Julian, which many of the so-called intellectuals have not been able to see through. And many of the ordinary people recognize that this is a stitch-up. The reality, though, is, the situation in Britain is particularly bad. We have a very right-wing government. We also have a situation where a number of people are experiencing not just COVID, but a pandemic of poverty. And so people are struggling hard to survive. And at this time, it's very easy to not be to be distracted from what are the big issues and what might really undermine British democracy. I'm glad to say that people like, for example, MIA, Low-Key, Roger Waters, the big celebs, Vivienne Westwood, and others have come out and Roger Waters and Vivienne Westwood for a number of years, have all stood out in support. And now in Parliament, we have both in the upper house and in the lower house, a number of people speaking up for Julian. I think the tone in the newspapers is also changing, although there is the occasional smear slipped in and the occasional quote from the likes of James Ball or, somebody else whose original pronouncements have been shown to be complete nonsense. But what has also changed is the recognition that this man has, you talked about the bail jumping and in order to seek asylum. He was given a very harsh sentence for that, which was a 10-month sentence. He served the 5 months that he was supposed to serve, and then he's still been held in prison for 2 years after that on remand, which is a very unusual thing to be held in a high security prison on remand. Then he was, they said that he would not be extradited, or the judge ruled, and yet he was kept in prison. This time the judge used the excuse that she wanted to be fair to the United States. So there is a huge amount of establishment pressure, firstly, not to talk about him, and secondly, not to support his case. The political situation in the country is such that people don't want to put their heads above the parapet, but yet, thanks to the work of people like the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, who are grassroots supporters who've been right from the days outside the embassy through to today, as well as lots of people like Matthew and Greg and others, people in professional positions who have huge amounts of experience, who have come out speaking for Assange, people like Craig Murray, who's now jailed in a Scottish prison on spurious charges, have all come out to speak in defense of Julian. And I think the mood is changing in Britain. The mood has changed. And if you look at the big rally that took place, there was a protest march from the BBC to the Royal Courts of Justice on Sunday, and the streets were full. Oxford Street was full. And so it does give me hope that there is going to be grassroots pressure, and judges know that we're looking at them and we're watching them and we're seeing the kinds of stitch-ups that are going on behind the scenes, and we're not going to stand for it. I hope that gives you some sense of what's going on here.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful, Deepa. And just one question from me, I guess. I'm quite curious to know how the Me Too movement has affected Julian. And I understand there was a lot of misinformation about the Swedish charge. And I think that has maybe affected some avenues of support, particularly from perhaps women politicians, or I know sort of the Green Party here, which is very strong on anti-violence towards women, or people not necessarily knowing the whole story. Have you got any comments about that?
I do, actually, and I'm quite. Firstly, there were never any charges. The case was kept in limbo for nearly 7 years without any charges being brought. And this was done intentionally so that exculpatory evidence, which would reveal what really happened, could not be put forward. Professor Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who's a native speaker of Swedish, has gone through the documentation at the Swedish end and at the British end, and has provided, through his book, which is coming out in English in the new year, but is already out in German, has explained very clearly how the system was corrupted and Julian was never given an opportunity to put his side of the case. And in any situation, whether it is violence against women, and I say this as a survivor myself, whether it is violence against women or other situations, people are meant to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And this new trend, which is accusation equal to guilt, is a bad trend because it undermines the cause of women, and it prevents women from getting justice, just as it happened in Sweden. Because if indeed, nobody will ever know what happened between Julian and those women other than the two parties there. But if cases like these are not brought to court, if people are not allowed to give, if evidence is not brought forward, then neither the women nor those accused like Julian get justice. And it is, as the Lisa Longstaff at Women Against Rape has said time and again, this is the state weaponizing women in order to achieve its own ends and hide its own war crimes. And that's what Britain and America have done in weaponizing the case in Sweden, because Sweden was always about extraditing Julian to America, and more evidence is coming out to show that. I also think it's very important for us to recognize that Julian is not being tried at the moment for anything to do with the accusations in Sweden. So the charges which are being brought against him are for the publication of information related to war crimes. And time and time again, we've seen smears being used against whistleblowers, against journalists, those who challenge the dominant state narrative that it's okay to kill hundreds and thousands of Black and brown people all over the world while taking the knee and pretending to care about Black Lives Matter. We've got to recognize that these are standard tactics, and we shouldn't be allowing for us to say the lives of 2 women in Sweden is more important than all the women who were raped, murdered, and tortured in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're not going to weigh these up against each other, and we shouldn't be prioritizing one over the other when we say we no longer care about what's happening to all these other crimes that have been revealed by Julian. I hope that makes sense, but I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that and putting it so clearly. I think it's such an important point for justice. And look, it's 1 hour 27 minutes and we're out of time. And I would like to thank everybody for coming along today, and all those who are going to hear this, and especially our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your expertise and your passion for justice, and all the hours that you spend on this great cause for justice and working for Julian. We really, really appreciate it, and not only us, but the future. And good quality journalism is in your debt. So thank you so very much, Matt, Greg, Deepa, and Daniel. And thanks everyone. And for our last word, just final farewell from Matt Brennan, Aotearoa for Assange.
Kia ora, Liz, and kia ora, everybody on the panel. It's really been our honour and our privilege to have you sharing your insight and your truth about this vital case. And I hope this is illuminated for all of you. Thank you for joining as well, the audience here today. And thank you for your great questions. It's really important that you raise those questions. And you can reach out to Aotearoa for Assange and connect with us. Our website is www.a4a.nz. And please get in touch. And hopefully this has inspired you to join the grassroots campaign. As Dr. DEEPA DRIVER said, that it's really important that the grassroots campaigning can put pressure on our elected representatives to do what is in the public interest. Believe it or not, that is their job. We lead them, not the other way around. And however, we cannot lead them if we are kept in the dark. So just to bring it into the final point here is that it's really important that we realize that the charges against us, Julian, criminalize publishing secret documents that reveal state crimes. In other words, it grants states impunity to do whatever they like, and if anyone blows the whistle on them, they go to jail. Now, that doesn't sound a lot like democracy to me or anyone else who understands what it's about. No, that is tyranny, plain and simple. And we do not want any of the leaders of the free world, our dear allies, United States, United Kingdom, to set such an example, because we do look up to the United States and the United Kingdom in matters of justice and democracy. And we daily call on the United Kingdom and the United States to uphold the rule of law and the right of citizens to know and to stand by the United States Constitution to protect the public's right to know, and to drop the charges against Julian Assange and let him go. And finally, to point out to everyone that, as I say, criminalizing publishing the truth makes this, whatever your concern is in the world, perhaps it's environmental causes, perhaps it is protection against sexual violence, gender equality, Indigenous rights, whatever you are passionate about, that you want to see different in the world. Consider that how could you possibly make any impact on the world if you are prevented from knowing the truth about when your government's, what is your government doing? So that's why I believe that this is the most important human rights case facing the world today. That the Julian Assange case is the front lines of the fight for global human rights. So stand up now, New Zealand. And please, Jacinda Ardern, our Prime Minister, and Nanaia Mahuta, our Foreign Affairs Minister, stand for a member of our Pacific region who stood for us by publishing vital truths in the interests of all human rights. And by standing for Julian, we will be standing for our values of human rights, the public's right to know, and peace, rangi Mārie. Kia ora.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you
for
all.
doing this.
Thank you.